If you oppose the ANC, then you could be in grave danger. This is what Ramaphosa has threatened to do to you. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has threatened to take action against those who oppose the ANC, particularly in its fight against the United States. This seems to be a direct page out of the Soviet playbook, particularly when talking about the USSR under Soviet Russia. But before we get into this shocking story, could I please remind you to subscribe to the channel? It's entirely free, and all you have to do is click on the subscribe button below the video. Furthermore, consider becoming a Power Club member for additional benefits. All you have to do is click on the join button below the video. Now let's get into it. So as explained in this IOL article, Cyril Ramaphosa vowed a crackdown on lobbyists who are urging US action against South Africa. The government will take action against groups and individuals lobbying the US to take punitive action against South Africa. He warned that such efforts threaten the country's sovereignty and constitutional order. Speaking to journalists on Wednesday on the sidelines of the ANC birthday celebrations, Ramaphosa said the state was carefully assessing whether such actions crossed legal boundaries. He stressed that any response would be grounded in law and due process, rejecting calls for rash or politically motivated action. "We are examining these matters with care and diligence," Ramaphosa said. "We are a constitutional democracy and we will act strictly within the law." Groups such as AfriForum and the Solidarity Movement have for years promoted claims that South Africa is pursuing race-based laws and that white citizens face systematic persecution. These claims, widely disputed by the government and independent analysts, have gained international traction after being echoed by influential figures, including Trump and South African-born businessman Elon Musk. What's immediately striking to me about this article is that it does seem to have a certain slant if we look at the language that is being used. So one important example of the slant is the way in which the article says race-based laws in quotation marks. Having such quotation marks suggests that race-based laws are not a proven fact in South Africa, but rather an opinion of groups such as AfriForum and Solidarity as mentioned in the article. However, we know that this is actually not up for dispute. After all, there are race-based laws in South Africa. It's in the name. For example, if we take a look at BEE, well, that's the most explicit example of a race-based law, because after all, it seeks to promote black employment over other racial groups. We also see how it claims that these claims, widely disputed by the government and independent analysts, have gained international traction after being echoed by influential figures, including Trump and South African-born businessman Elon Musk. Now, of course, what this article very carefully does is it claims that, yes, the government is disputing whether or not these laws are race-based, but it also says that independent analysts are doing the same thing. So it makes it sound as if analysts on a whole support the government in this regard. But what it doesn't mention is that there are also independent analysts who believe that there are in fact race-based laws. And so already we see a slant. And this is very important to note, because I'm going to reveal something about IOL that is quite alarming a little later on in the video. But immediately after reading this article, I began to think to myself, this sounds a lot like the practices that I read about, which happened in none other than Soviet Russia. And so in order to determine whether or not there is a link between Ramaphosa's actions and those of the communist governments, I decided to consult AI. So I started off by asking Claude, what are the common tactics employed by communist governments? And Claude gave me quite an in-depth answer, which we will get into shortly. But before then, I wanted to follow up and ask Claude, well, can you please give me the sources you found the information from? Claude explained, I apologize for any confusion. I didn't use external sources for that response. I drew on general historical knowledge from my training about patterns observed across various communist governments throughout the 20th century. So I followed up by asking, what were the various communist governments you observed in order to reach your conclusion? Which it explained, Major long-standing states, such as the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1991, the People's Republic of China, 1949 to present, Cuba, 1959 to present, North Korea, 1948 to present, Vietnam, 1945 in the north to the unified 1975 to present, and then finally Laos from 1975 to present. And so what we're going to be discussing here isn't just something that happened in one or two states. It's a common practice across the major communist governments across the world. Now, scrolling back to our list, we see that Ramaphosa's threat falls firmly into the category of political monopoly. You see, as explained here, communist governments tend to favor single-party rule with bans or severe restrictions on opposition parties. And of course, if an opposition party was to dissent, as the ANC would claim, or even an individual or group, as they explain, such as AfriForum, Solidarity, or even individuals, well, then they are going to take action against them. We also see, however, that there is social organization where this also falls under. So, as explained here, social organization can include mass organizations aligned with party goals, such as youth leagues, workers' unions, and women's groups. Of course, this is commonplace in South Africa. We know that there is the ANC Youth League. There's also a Women's League, and of course, COSATU, who is part of the Tripartite Alliance. We then see how political education campaigns are commonplace, surveillance systems to monitor potential opposition, and the use of internal passports or household registration systems to control movement. Then there happens to be the security apparatus, secret police or internal security forces to suppress dissent. Now, of course, we haven't yet seen this occur in South Africa, but Ramaphosa's announcement certainly seems to be leaning towards this practice. After all, he has claimed that he will take action, albeit legal action, against opponents of the ANC in this fight against the United States. There, interestingly enough, also happens to be a line on purges of party members or officials deemed disloyal. We've seen this with the expulsion of the likes of Ace Magashule and Jacob Zuma from the ANC, so that element certainly exists. Now, aside from the security apparatus and then, of course, the sort of suppression of voices in that regard, there also is another important issue that's at play, specifically information management. You see, this includes state control or heavy influence over media and publishing. And this is a really important point for us to mention because the information that I am about to share with you shows that the ANC has enormous influence over the media in South Africa today. So the largest news agency in South Africa, as well as Africa as a whole, happens to be News 24, which falls under the Media 24 banner within Naspers, its holding company. Now, as we can see here on investing.com, we are able to see exactly who owns Naspers. And it explains here how Public Investment Corporation Limited owns approximately 24.92% of Naspers. Now, this is really important for us to note because the PIC is wholly owned by the South African government. This organization is an entity through which the government implements its policy of broad-based Black economic empowerment. It is also responsible for investing in the South African government's employees' pension fund. Now, of course, one could argue that the PIC simply views Naspers as a logical place to invest, right? In order to protect its investors and provide them with a lucrative investment over the long term. Still, this doesn't necessarily mean that the government doesn't have influence over Naspers and its decision making. We know that shareholders, of course, receive voting rights within an organization, and so there will be direct influence there. But what's really interesting is that not only does the government have influence over News 24, specifically through its holding company, but other outlets as well. Remember how I explained that IOL was going to be explored a little later in the video? Well, here it is. So Independent Online is South Africa's oldest news site and a leading platform for news, current affairs, and content in the country, as explained here on the Sekunjalo website. So IOL reaches millions of readers monthly, readers who return to the site and spend significant time accessing news and information. But what's really interesting here is that this article is provided on the Sekunjalo website. And for those who might not know, this is an investment house with ties to the PIC as well as the ANC itself. So using Google's AI overview, I asked, does the PIC have any ownership stakes within Sekunjalo? And it explains no, but the PIC was a major investor and lender to Sekunjalo-led consortiums, notably for their 2013 purchase of independent media, which again is IOL, but later took legal action against Sekunjalo Independent Media for loan defaults leading to ongoing disputes and liquidation applications. And so, yes, one could argue that PIC no longer has any stake within Independent Online or any of its affiliates, and so there isn't that government influence. But apart from PIC, Sekunjalo and the ANC have indisputable links. You see, back in 2019, ahead of South Africa's general election, Sekunjalo decided to donate 1 million rand to the ANC's election campaign. As explained here, on the eve of Election Day, the Western Cape ANC announced it would return a donation it had accepted just 2 days earlier from Iqbal Survey and his Sekunjalo Investment Holdings Company. Sekunjalo has controversially benefited from Public Investment Corporation investments. This egg-on-face situation happened as factional interests compete on the campaign trail. In another twist, Survey hit back, fingering Deputy Finance Minister and PIC Chairperson Mondli Gungubele as being behind the move. So we've now seen how Sekunjalo has directly funded the ANC's election campaign and no doubt has a political bias. But what's really alarming is that if we look at the makeup of Independent Online, we see just how many different news outlets fall under its jurisdiction. So here on Wikipedia, it explains, IOL serves the online versions of a number of South African newspapers, including The Star, The Cape Times, Cape Argus, Weekend Argus, The Mercury, Sunday Tribune, The Independent on Saturday, and The Sunday Independent. Interestingly, IOL regularly distributes Chinese state media content as well. And so there you have it. The ANC is very much establishing its influence over the media in South Africa, and particularly the country's largest media corporations. However, the socialist tendencies of the ANC does not end there. So another common practice among communist and socialist governments, as pointed out by AI, happens within the economy. And it explains here, it's through central planning, through state committees that set production targets, prices, and resource allocation, the collectivization of agriculture and nationalization of industries, state monopolies on major sectors of the economy, and the elimination of or severe restriction of private property and markets. Now, of course, EWC, expropriation without compensation, comes into play directly when it comes to private property. We also know that there are a fair amount of state monopolies. So, for example, Eskom. And we also know that nationalization of industries is underway. You see, just the other day, ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula promised the nationalization of the Reserve Bank as well as expropriation without compensation. And so what this all shows us is that the ANC is adopting an increasing number of common practices across the world's most infamous communist and socialist regimes. With the ANC seemingly showing no signs of backing down, it remains to be seen who will be able to stop them in their tracks before it's too late. Thank you very much for tuning into this video. If you found it informative, please remember to subscribe to the channel for more content. Until next time, I'm Matthew Cohen, and this is the Power Pod.